Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. Hyperabyssic Ontology, Part 2, From Nothing to Something. How does the Kabbalistic zero manifest itself as the supernal triad at the summit of the tree of life, initiating its unfolding? According to the 0 equals 2 formula, nothingness internally structures itself to appear as if it were something, and in thus appearing as something to itself, something can thereby be said to exist or be real with a capital R, in Jacques Lacan's terminology, through an ontology of virtuality. Understood in this sense, existence is metaphysically ungrounded. Existing things cannot be said to possess a positively characterizable essence. Instead, the essence of something is nothing, what Aleister Crowley calls the Kabbalistic zero, and that nothing stands in a further negative relation to itself, such that it is always manifesting as a virtual real something, a process which Crowley represents by the notation 0 to the 0 power. How does this process proceed in Kabbalistic symbolism? According to the Book of Lies, beyond and above the unity symbolized by Kether at the apex of the tree of life is, quote, the anti-primal triad which is not God, which corresponds to the negative, which is before Kether in the Kabbalistic system. Kether is numbered 1, the unity, and the negative stands for the nothingness of the Kabbalistic zero that underlies that unity. In other words, unity is not the ultimate horizon of being. According to Crowley's use of Kabbalistic number symbolism, there is a 0 that precedes the 1 on the number line of reality. In the register of this primordial triad, according to the Book of Lies, nothing is, nothing becomes, nothing is not. Crowley comments, this is the negative trinity, underlying and atheistically negating the positive trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Crowley says its 3 statements are, in an ultimate sense, identical. These 3 statements describe the dynamic, self-relational character of the Kabbalistic zero through Crowley's reinterpretation of the significance of what S.L.M. Mathers dubbed the 3 veils of negative existence: Ein, Ein Sof, and Ein Sof or nothing, infinite nothing, and the infinite light of nothing. In his essay Barashith, Crowley rejects Mathers' characterization of the 3 veils in terms of what he calls, or Mathers rather calls, negative existence, in favor of his own concept of the Kabbalistic zero. This is because the term negative existence implies that nothingness is a thing that exists, which, Crowley argues, cannot be the case, because then it would not really be nothingness. Rather, absolute nothingness does not exist. And since logically a double negative equals a positive value, to posit the absoluteness of the Kabbalistic nothingness is equivalent to positing that something non-absolute in nature does positively exist, namely the finite and historically contingent cosmic universe. In this logical procedure, the term that is dropped out of the equation is the metaphysical unity or supernatural dimension of being of traditional Platonic negative theology, which is the characteristic mode of conceptualizing the divine in the Aeon of Osiris, whether in a pagan, Christian, Jewish, or Islamic context. Crowley rejects the metaphysical unity as the ultimate constitutive horizon of being, replacing it with the Kabbalistic zero. Along with this transposition comes a different strategy of conceptualizing the status and spiritual role of the via negativa, where the divine is not projected into another world, but is instead expressed as the self-realization of the true will of each person's unique potentiality for existence. If in the Aeon of Osiris the mystic sought communion with the metaphysical unity beyond, in the Aeon of Horus the magician achieves union with the Kabbalistic zero within. The reason why Crowley can so powerfully use the Jewish Kabbalistic tradition to mediate this transvaluation of values derives from historical differences between Judaism and the other major monotheistic traditions of the Aeon of Osiris. Unlike Christianity and Islam, Judaism was not a statecraft religion. Instead, it survived as a family and community-based practice within the hegemonic space of other religiously organized nations. Jewish discourse is therefore oriented around the experience of exile or diaspora, where the divine is experienced as a presence through absence. This orientation around what Walter Benjamin and others call the messianic trace is distinctly different than the triumphal worship of imperial power practiced by Christendom and the Caliphate. Come modernity, this difference also permits Jewish culture to more easily slide into atheist modes of modern expression than Christian and Islamic cultures, both of which have more violently resisted the shift to contemporary secularity. Crowley mimics this Jewish difference in his own thought, using Kabbalah to construct an atheist spirituality in a manner analogous to what a wide gamut of Jewish intellectuals were also doing at the same time, whether this be Franz Kafka, Walter Benjamin, or Martin Buber, for example. These themes are concisely recapitulated by Crowley's aforementioned phraseology: nothing is, nothing becomes, nothing is not. In other words, to say that the absolute nothingness of the Kabbalistic zero is or exists is equivalent to saying that it becomes something, namely reality, by necessarily negating even itself, so that it is itself not. This is then equivalent to saying that the Kabbalistic zero names process or becoming itself, or the dynamic, undetermined quality of reality in terms of which change is possible in accordance with will. The form of Crowley's argument arguably derives from the concept of the double negation or negation of negation, described in G.W.F. Hegel's Logic, which formed part of Crowley's reading while composing Bar Sheath, and which contributes to the intertextual background of sources transvaluated by the reception event of the text of the Book of the Law. I would argue that many of these subtleties of the 0 equals 2 formula derive in significant part from Crowley's reading of Hegel's Logic, almost certainly in the 1873 English translation by William Wallace, still in print from Oxford University Press, and this in turn informs the deeper philosophical argument and indeed the very triadic structure of the Book of the Law's 3 chapters. More specifically, the influence of the Logic on Crowley's thought at the juncture in question, circa 1902 to 4, is that it facilitates his transition from a commitment to Buddhist ideas to his own mature philosophical position, eventually called Thelema in the Book of the Law, by rethinking the Buddhist concept of shunyata, or nothingness, in terms analogous to Hegel's treatment of nothingness in his Logic as the negative essence of being. Hegel's genealogical influence on Crowley does not make Thelema equivalent to Hegel's absolute idealism. Rather, it contextualizes Crowley as a reader of Hegel within the complex and often ambiguous intertextual spectrum of Western philosophy's response to Hegel's thought, and to the thought of German idealism more generally. A version of Hegelian idealism called British idealism was influential at Cambridge in the late 19th and early 20th century. For example, J.M.E. McTaggart, who taught Bertrand Russell and G.E. Moore, began lecturing on Hegel at Trinity College, Cambridge in 1897, while Crowley was still an undergraduate there. Although British idealism as such does not appear to be a major influence on Crowley, he would certainly have been aware of Hegelian currents of thought while studying philosophy at Cambridge, and these likely influenced him to take a closer look at the argument of Hegel's Logic half a decade later. In the Book of Lies, Crowley interprets the anti-primal triad symbolized by the 3 veils of the negative in terms of Hegel's famous triad of being, nothingness, and becoming that initiates the dialectic at its most abstract and formal level. Crowley writes that the anti-primal triad harmonize being, becoming, non-being, the 3 possible modes of conceiving the universe. The relevant section in Hegel's Logic reads in part, quote, "Pure being is immediacy itself, simple and indeterminate. However, mere being, as it is mere abstraction, is therefore the absolute negative, which in a similarly immediate aspect is just nothing. In other words, being is an absolute absence of attributes, and so is not." To which Hegel adds, "All that is wanted is to realize that these beginnings are nothing but these empty abstractions, one as empty as the other. This leads to the onward movement of being and nothing and gives them a true concrete significance. And again, the truth of being and nothing is accordingly the unity of the two, and this unity is becoming, unquote. However, because becoming is the unity of being and nothing, and being was discovered to really be nothing, then what Hegel is saying is that ultimately there is only nothingness, which can be understood from three different perspectives. Recall Crowley's similar remark that the three statements are, in an ultimate sense, identical. Elaborating on the deep structure of this process, Slavoj Žižek writes, quote, Hegel starts with an apparent positivity which, upon closer inspection, immediately reveals itself to be its own negation. This is not yet negation proper. Negation is a movement of mediation. The movement proper begins when the original form, which is its own negation, is negated or replaced by a higher form. And that negation of negation occurs when we realize that this higher form which negated the first effectively maintains, and even asserts more strongly, the starting point. In other words, truly actualizes it, confers on it some positive content, unquote. Žižek continues, quote, the opposition of poles in the dialectical syllogism thus conceals the fact that one of the poles already is the unity of the two. So for Hegel, there is no need for a third element to bring the two together. This is why Hegel's dialectics is radically groundless, abyssal, a process of the self-relating of the two, which lacks any third. For Hegel, the goal is thus not to reestablish the symmetry and balance of the two opposing principles, but to recognize in one pole the symptom of the failure of the other and not vice versa, unquote. In the case of the initially opposed principles of being and nothingness, it is nothingness that is implicitly already the unity of the two, such that the movement to the third term of the dialectical triad becoming is simply the recognition or making explicit of this fact. Becoming is nothing but the negation of the negation, the self-relating of the two, whereby the unity of being is disclosed as its own negation, or as being already its opposite, nothingness. Unity drops out of the syllogism, and we are left with a logical schema suspiciously similar in structure to Crowley's 0 = 2 formula. I therefore interpret Crowley's expression of the Kabbalistic zero as 0 to the 0 power as equivalent to Hegel's concept of negation of negation. Furthermore, this is a dynamic conception of nothingness. Slavoj Žižek describes Dieter Heinrich's view that autonomous negation comprises the basic matrix of Hegel's dialectical procedure. Žižek here is citing Dieter Heinrich's Between Kant and Hegel. Heinrich contemplates how the dialectic gets started for Hegel, writing, quote, starting only with negation means having nothing but negation. Now, in order to have nothing but negation, we need negation more than once. For, in Hegel's view, negation is relational or mediated, in the sense that there must be something it negates. But inasmuch as there is nothing that negation could possibly negate, owing to the assumption that we have only negation, negation can only negate itself. Accordingly, autonomous negation can only be a negation of negation. Quote, unquote. Therefore, Heinrich concludes, the ultimate criterion of Hegel's dialectical methodology is Kant's ideal of autonomy as complete self-determination. Freedom, in other words, is the ground and source of the dialectic, just as it is for the thelemic reading of the Kabbalah, whose import is do what thou wilt. Autonomous negation as ontological nothingness redoubled is the free, open-ended, contingent production of something made up of nothing. Nothingness is folded in on itself and knotted into positive being, giving birth to the determinate structure of being symbolized by the tree of life. Crowley summarizes this concisely when he writes, the statement, nothing is not, is technically equivalent to something is. If nothing is not, 0 to the 0 power, is the same as something is, then the symbolism of the supernal triad simply expresses another more determinate aspect the dynamic process represented by the antiprimal triad. The initial antiprimal triad replicates itself like a fractal, permeated by its own internal dynamism. It unfolds itself as the structure of the tree of life, first as the supernals at the most abstract level, followed by the increasingly concrete modalities of being, or is it better to say nothingness, represented by the lower layers of the tree. Love is the law, love under will.